introducing Martha to you tonight, Martha Hennessy, for this webinar on Dorothy Day and Gospel Nonviolence. People are just drifting out of the office there in the background. Martha's had a very busy day today and a busy few days, and we're really grateful to her for making time for this event this evening. This morning, one of the things she's done is to give an interview to the staff writer at the tablet, Maddock Cairns, and that interview will appear in the tablet probably, can't promise it, but probably, if Maddock can write it up in time, in our Easter issue, which is the 16th of April issue of the tablet. And if you would like to, if you're not already, I can barely imagine this, but if by any chance you're not already a subscriber to the tablet, there are introductory offers available from I think about 20 quid for a quarter for a digital subscription, £30 for for 3 months of getting the tablet through the post and also have digital access. And if you go to our website, thetablet.co.uk, you'll be able to subscribe. And if by any chance you're not able to subscribe, or you get stuck, or nobody answers your phone call, or your mouse isn't giving you the right answers, just you can email me, the editor, bwalsh@thetablet.co.uk, and I will make sure that any problems you have subscribing or putting your money through, we'll make sure that works well for you. This evening's event is very appropriately being sponsored by CAFOD, United Kingdom's Overseas Aid and Development Agency of the Catholic Church in England and Wales. And CAFOD, I'm sure you've all heard of CAFOD, who do fantastic work across the world. They bring hope and compassion to poor communities, standing side by side with them to end poverty and injustice. And I can assure you all, in case you don't know already, that CAFOD works with real passion and professionalism. And their website is cafod.org.uk. And of course, CAFOD is part of the Disasters Emergency Appeal for the Ukraine at the moment, and you can donate to that appeal through CAFOD. And the Afghanistan crisis appeal is also still ongoing, and children in Afghanistan are starving, and any help you could give to CAFOD would be much appreciated. So I hope you can both, if by any chance you don't subscribe to the tablet, you can find £30 for us and £300 for the Disasters Emergency Appeal. I'm going to introduce Martha, who's going to speak to us for half an hour or so, or whenever she runs out of steam, and then we're going to open it up to questions. And at the bottom of the screen, you should all see that chat box. And if you put your question into that at the end of Martha's talk, I'll field the questions through to Martha. So I hope we're going to have a chance to hear Martha, learn about gospel nonviolence, and have a chance for a bit of a discussion at the end. Martha, who I'm sure you might know this, is the she's the 7th child of Dorothy Day's only child, Tamar, and she divides her time between the family farm in Vermont. Martha, is that your mother's, the same farm as you grew up in where is it, Pickettsville or somewhere? Is it that farm? Anyway, that was a farm that I've read about so often. And that's Martha has that farm in Vermont, and she does volunteer work, of course, at the Mary House Catholic Worker in New York City. She's a retired occupational therapist and the grandmother of 8, or at least it was 8 when I last checked in. And she's been arrested and imprisoned, protesting nuclear power, war, the use of drones, the torture of prisoners in Guantanamo, and other prisons, and the use of starvation as a weapon of war in Yemen. She's traveled to Russia, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Jordan, and Palestine to understand the effects of war on other peoples. And Martha travels and speaks on topics of life and work in community, Catholic social teaching, and of course, peacemaking efforts in the tradition of the Catholic worker movement and the tradition of her grandmother, Dorothy Day. When Pope Francis spoke at the US Congress in 2015, he spoke of 4 great heroes of America. And you probably remember that it was Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Thomas Merton, and the 4th name was Dorothy Day, who he spoke of her social activism, her passion for justice and for the cause of the oppressed, were inspired by the gospel, her faith, and the example of the saints. And I think for so many of us, there was a moment in our lives of encounter with Dorothy Day. Perhaps it was through her work, books, film, and it was a moment when everything we thought about being a Catholic was exploded. I can remember that moment of discovery, of a sense of meeting what Catholicism could look like, and what a shock it was, and reading the story of how that terrified us and opposition it led to, and it kind of made the whole picture of what being a Catholic, being a Christian in the modern world might look like. And it's something I think people who can remember that moment will never forget the impact, the way that Dorothy Day brought the faith alive for us. And to speak to somebody like Martha tonight is a great privilege for me. And a great moment for us, I know, was when we published some pieces by Martha's sister, Kate, who has written the most wonderful book about Dorothy Day. If you don't know it, The World Will Be Saved by Beauty, Dorothy Day. It's still available. It's the most fabulous book that is gets right to the heart of Dorothy Day, but it's a fantastic biography in its own right as a read. And one of the things she writes about was, and she's written about this for the tablet, is about spending Christmases at that farm in Vermont where Martha and Kate were young children, and grandmother would come to spend Christmas with them in the snow. And things were quite tough, but these were miraculous moments. And if you get a chance to read that story, I would urge you to do so. So Martha, I'm sorry I've gone on a bit too long, but this is a very special moment for us, and I'm really grateful to you for talking to us. So Martha Hennessy, thanks so much.
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you all for coming. And these Zooms are something that we're all trying to get used to here. But I truly, truly prefer to be in person with folks, but this is how it is for now. And I'm very happy to see Brian here. I hope that he has a lot to contribute as well. I want to just give you a little bit of a prayer. I think it's always good to start these important endeavors, these difficult endeavors, with a prayer. And this is an odd kind of prayer. I believe it was written by one of the Catholic workers out in Oklahoma, who has recently died. And I'm sorry, I'm forgetting his name at this very moment that I should be remembering it. And he wrote these beautiful mysteries to go along with praying the rosary. And I chose the joyous mysteries because it resonates with me in these times of extremity. Beauty in the midst of destruction, joy in the midst of sorrow, wisdom in the face of folly, mercy in the face of wrath, new life in the midst of death. So I was very grateful to, hear from Pope Francis. He is a pope after Dorothy's own heart. He's very excited about the canonization process. He recognizes how the US Church desperately needs a declared saint like Dorothy. And in this Lenten season, let's also not forget that it is a time of penance and humility. And what more can we ask for in terms of the difficulties that we're faced with this latest war that has been opened up to the globe? And I want to quote from today's gospel reading from John, where Jesus says, "The Son cannot do anything on his own." And that is certainly our condition. We must entrust our cause to God, because that's where our help comes from. And we hope to change the social order. We hope to change it through love and through nonviolence. And Dorothy understood this very clearly. Christians are to be pacifists. When we talk about Dorothy's pacifism, we talk as if that was something new to her, or something new to any Christian, or something sort of tacked on as an afterthought. But the fact of the matter is, to be a Christian is to be nonviolent in the spirit of Jesus. And he lived and worked with the poor. He preached, he healed, he belonged with the poor and the marginalized. And he taught us that our material wealth belongs to the poor. And this is what Dorothy tried to create in her lifetime in the 20th century, in the Empire State of New York, the Empire City of New York City. And she gave us an incredible example. And we can never lose track of the fact that this is about self-sacrifice. This is about a standard of living that has never been realized in the human history, to be, such a high standard of living, and to be acquired at significant, tremendous cost to the rest of the globe. We are a fraction of the globe's population, consuming much of its resources. So all of this relates to nonviolence. War comes in the face of exploiting resources. And I believe that this is part of the picture with this business with Russia and Ukraine. And Dorothy talked about the Sermon on the Mount. She said, our manifesto is the Sermon on the Mount, which means that we will try to be peacemakers. And some people refer to the Catholic worker as a fruit of the Catholic Church and of Catholic social teaching. And so, of course, we must rely on the Catholic social teachings. And I just want to reiterate for all of us, in the newspaper that Dorothy and the community published, she always included any recent encyclicals by the popes, but I'm going to go back 90 years. And this, of course, is with Quadrice. Sorry, I might mispronounce this damn Latin, but Quadrissimo Anno, the 40 years after Rerum Novarum of giving the rights back to workers through the Catholic Church. And this is Pope Pius XI of 1931. And these words are applicable and relevant today. So if you'll indulge me. Quote, unbridled ambition for domination has succeeded the desire for gain. The whole economic regime has become hard, cruel, and relentless in a ghastly measure. Furthermore, the intermingling and scandalous confusion of the functions and duties of civil authority and of the economic organization have produced crying evils. The state, which should be intent only on justice and the common good, has become instead a slave bound over to the service of human passion and greed. And of course, we know that Dorothy as a Christian radical, didn't believe that it was the nation state that any of our solutions would come from, that we had to be personalists and that we had to respond to the needs of those directly in front of us. People hungry, people unhoused, people not getting proper medical care. And another very important tenet of her gospel nonviolence is that every human person is God's miracle. We must look at each other as a miracle, each and every one of us, and nobody is expendable. We must embrace all people of goodwill who serve God, who are doing good works. And Dorothy, of course, was very ecumenical. And the diversity of the Catholic worker movement certainly reflects that. And, you know, not only simple tolerance of each other, but also respect for each other. All of this happens within the context of daily living. Our nonviolent practice gives us opportunities every single moment of every day. And of course, working in the houses of hospitality is a fine example of that. Peter's program, let's not lose sight of that. He spoke about clarification of thought and roundtable discussions. And for me, that speaks to dialogue, that speaks to a democratic process. I think much of the dialogue has been lost in today's world, much of the diplomacy, much of the sharing and listening with one another. And Peter also spoke about houses of hospitality, and that's where the practice comes in, where you come up against yourself every day in terms of judging people, in terms of being impatient, in terms of learning how to be in community with each other and with the homeless and the poor. And of course, we have the third plank of the Catholic worker program of agronomic universities. And you know, here we have the food chain being disrupted with this current war. Ukraine, I remember my mother talking about Ukraine being the breadbasket of the world. And we're hearing reports about who will suffer with this latest disruption. And it's the poor, it's many countries of the Middle East. And once again, we have to review our program. We have to renew our relationship to the roots of Peter and Dorothy, all within the context of Catholic social teaching, Catholic practice. Peter was aware of the long history of the monasteries providing hospitality, and you don't wait. You don't stand around waiting for someone else to provide. You do it yourself with your own hands, wherever you find yourself. And Dorothy also talked about the works of mercy are a way of preventing bloody revolt. You cause enough destitution and enough oppression of the peoples that the discontent will rear its head in very dangerous and very ugly ways. And so practicing the works of mercy clearly is a way to bring justice and to bring basic needs to everyone. Some of the other points that I've just been gleaning from various readings. We are to find concordances. We are learn to compromise and to move ahead together. And I think that is very key. Dorothy was good about quoting, I think it was Pope John the 23rd who talked about concordances. And it's very easy to find a contradiction and controversy. And today we are being driven by this media that is absolutely saturated with propaganda. And if we lose sight of this capacity, you know, to dialogue together and to compromise together, it's very difficult to move ahead, to move forward. And on a personal note, Dorothy wrote a little bit about, most recently in a Lenten reflection that was put together by the Franciscan media. I recently read, she made the point, we are to endure wrongs that are made upon us. We are to endure these wrongs patiently, which is such a difficult thing to do. And yet we are okay in getting outraged and protesting when wrongs are being done to others. So I thought that was an interesting little vignette in terms of our daily practice. I would like to read you something from April of 1948, where Dorothy is, trying again to explain herself. Being in the US imperial state means that we do have a permanent war economy. And I think that the way Dorothy articulated what this meant in 1948 is also worth revisiting. And it's titled, "We are un-American, we are Catholic." And I do believe that we are faced with that every day in the United States. Are we to be good citizens, or are we to be truly Christian in our outlook on the treatment of others? And this is what she says. If we are to accept the materialistic and atheistic philosophy of the capitalist state, which holds sway in the United States, then there can be but one little objection to this state of affairs. If our values are derived from the stock exchange, if we are to join in the psychopathic mania that has made war an end in itself, which has made it the norm of the American economy, if we are to be united against an ideology rather than for an ideology, then we are on the right track. And I just find these to be very strong words. And I'm glad that I'm not the only one who's ranting and raving, that this has been going on for some time. I also want to just point out something else from 1946. This was a pamphlet regarding the weapons of the spirit. I think it was from the Catholic Conscientious Objector, but I'm not sure of my resources. But with this, Dorothy says, I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time reading this. We began to fight the issue of the use of force very early on in our history. And, what better place but the United States to fight this history, to point out this history. And Dorothy herself had to witness so many wars in her lifetime. And right after World War II, we just simply, we used the bomb, we tested the bomb, we used it, and then we just picked up where the Nazis left off with this technology. And in 1946, we just geared up for this nuclear economy. And Dorothy's voice was a very lonely, very small voice when she wrote that article to President Truman saying, "We have annihilated 300,000 people, Jubilee." Her voice of outrage was something that was not clearly being heard from the Catholic Church of the United States. And so her opposition to all of these wars cost. And in my teenage and early 20 years, we were dealing with the Vietnam War. My brother, as a 20-year-old, was sent to Vietnam, and I, as a 14-year-old, watched him go out the door, not knowing whether I would ever see him again. So this has been with us and with my family for quite some time. And it's hard, it's painful, it's very painful. There are so many families. We have soldiers who are killing themselves daily since the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And let's not forget them. Let's remember that this stance of nonviolence is a way of saying no to sending our own soldiers out. Right now, the young Russian soldiers are faced with this horrific conscription and being sent to the battlefield. I'd like to again give some accolades to Pope Francis. You know, he very clearly has said most recently that war is barbaric, war is sacrilegious. And what we're witnessing today is much of society is trying to justify this response to sending in weapons to Ukraine and justifying this demonization of Russia. And it's not acceptable. And Pope Francis is making that point, that this is something we have been following for altogether too long, and it must stop. And whatever we can do to raise a voice must be done. And so that's part of why I'm here today, is to help us all, to give courage to each other. You know, none of this can be done without community. None of this can be done without prayer. And Dorothy just gives us the astounding example of, you know, how to continue on, how to not give up, how to not despair. And we are very grateful for her for that. I want to quote our second Catholic president with some of the things that he has recently said. And, you know, it's our jobs to point out what's wrong here. President Biden, you know, referring to this recent war, unprovoked brute force and disinformation is being used to satisfy a craving for absolute power and control. And another quote, threatening Russia, don't even think about moving on 1 single inch of NATO territory. Well, I'm sorry, we are projecting our own psychopathic doings onto others. And as Christians, we're called to look at the log in our own eye before we try to remove the splinter in the other's eye. And I want to end with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., because we carried him with us into the Kings Bay nuclear submarine military base on the 50th anniversary of his killing. And this was certainly a state killing, similar to John F. Kennedy. I believe that what we're faced with today is just, we're harvesting the results of the murder of these great leaders that we had in the 1960s. So this is from Martin Luther King Jr., and it's relevant to the Vietnam War, but it's relevant to us here now. Here is the true meaning and value of compassion and nonviolence. When it helps us to see the enemy's point of view, to hear his questions, to know his assessment of ourselves. For from his view, we may indeed see the basic weaknesses of our own condition. And if we are mature, we may learn and grow and profit from the wisdom of the brothers and sisters who are called to the opposition. So I would simply end on that note of gospel nonviolence and its influence on so many great leaders in our history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martha. There are quite a few questions coming in. Just a few seconds of stillness as we just think about what you said. There's some unfamiliar and really lovely faces I can see on my screen, people I haven't some familiar faces I haven't seen for a while, and there are some faces of names of people I recognize but haven't seen your faces before. And it's lovely to see everybody here. And there's such attentiveness while you were speaking, Martha. People really listening. One of the things that you can't help being aware of if you read your grandmother's life is even one of the books she wrote, was it The Long Loneliness? You read the stories of, I was reading last night in the 1950s, those protests against the nuclear drills in New York, where Dorothy and at first not much more than a handful of like-minded followers went to the local park. They were arrested, spent time in prison. The hostility, the fear, the outrage that they provoked, obviously amongst ordinary Americans, but even almost more so amongst fellow Catholics. And it was a sense that that message, Dorothy's message of non-gospel violence, it provoked more fury amongst bishops and cardinals and ordinary Catholics than it did amongst secular people. And here we are 70 years later. Do you have a sense that the gospel of non-violence, is it still something that infuriates, angers, terrifies Catholics, priests and bishops perhaps particularly, as much as it did then? Or do you think you feel somehow a change in that message is somehow finding a resonance perhaps in the papacy of Pope Francis? John 23rd, of course, I know your grandmother admired a lot, but somehow with Francis you both get a sense of somebody, a pope, saying similar things and getting precisely the same infuriated opposition and misunderstanding. Or how do you think the arc of these things has changed since your grandmother's time through your own life?
Well, I think that the fury is still there. You know, we're all faced with the war in our own hearts, and you know that's the journey. That's the vocation of a lifetime as a follower of Christ in our own times. I do think that we're getting to such a point of insanity and destruction, you know, with climate collapse, and you know our very futures are so threatened that we are getting better about recognizing those voices that are saying this is not working. This model has to change. As far as the U.S. Bishops, there is a group who understand and do have significant concern. And I can't help but be so grateful to Archbishop Wester of Santa Fe, New Mexico. He has just come up with this pastoral where he is saying we must abolish nuclear weapons. There's no such thing as a just war in the face of these modern weapons. And that was very brave of him, coming out of Los Alamos, where the bomb was born, where that whole economy is based on nuclear weapons production. So let's see what happens next in terms of these words, coming from the pulpits around the country. I mean, I do feel that the U.S. Catholic Church plays a key role in all of this, being at the heart of empire, really needing to speak out in a way that gives hope, in a way that leads us in a direction of, concrete action, following our treaties, following our faith teachings. There's always hope. We always have to feel hopeful, and we always have to keep pushing each other to act. And those voices of fury will always be there, because who wants to give up their comfortable way of life? Who wants to give up their privileges? I mean, that's what we're up against. And I do believe that the nuclear arsenal is the linchpin to white supremacy. I do believe that it's a complete scandal. Dorothy spoke about, the great scandal is that the vast majority of these nuclear weapons are in the hands of Christians, and I would just simply add white Christians. So this is a reckoning that has to come from within. The great question is, will we save ourselves in time?
Sure. Now, Martha, I've got a question from Liz Dodd, who there was a memorable interview that Liz did with your sister Kate in the Tablet a couple of years ago. And Kate came into the office and we all met her, and then they sat down together, and it was a lovely piece. And Liz asks, what can the communities, families and parishes that are hoping to take in Ukrainian refugees learn from the Catholic worker model of hospitality? I think there's several, and I think it's true throughout Europe. We know it's happening in Poland in a big way, but in the UK, it's something like 100,000 people have volunteered to take in Ukrainian refugees. And Liz is asking, what are the kind of lessons that they might learn from the Catholic worker experience?
Yes, respond immediately. There is a woman here in Ireland who's putting pressure on her bishop to hand over a house that has 9 rooms in it, so that she can start to place Ukrainian refugees. And the Catholic worker model, accepts who comes to the door for the most part. And I think what I find so sad is, this response to Ukraine is beautiful. But let's not forget how, with the US wars in Iraq and Libya and Syria, US supported wars, Germany ended up taking in like 2 million people in the mid 2000s as a result of our preemptive wars. So the examples are there for us to respond. And of course, Pope Francis saying that Mass early on in his papacy at, I think it was Lampedusa, the altar was an overturned boat. This was in the Mediterranean where refugees were coming across. So from the very beginning, he has pointed out that this is what we need to be doing. I would say that we also need to ask, what is causing this influx? The climate disruption and the war making is displacing so many millions of people. The largest migrations in human history, perhaps. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but we really need to pay attention to what's causing this displacement and to address that as well. And on a personal level, it's all about going with less, living more simply so that the resources can be shared more widely. And the Catholic worker example is there to inspire us.
Thank you. Martha, there are a number, not unexpectedly, questions about the war in Ukraine, which of course all of us are seized with concern and anguish and grief about. And there's a couple of I'll roll them in together a bit. There's two or three different people asking, what can Ukrainians do without raising arms to resist? I completely agree with the sentiment of violence being unchristian, but how do you allow the Russian tanks to roll over their peaceful neighbours? I'm sure you've thought a lot about, and you've heard that kind of question over the years so many times. How would Dorothy Day reply to that, and how would you respond to those kind of questions?
Well, I'll tell you, Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and all the others are rejoicing to see those Russian tanks rolling in. So let's think about that. And of course, the right of self-defense is something to be discussed and considered. And I think that we cannot underestimate what NATO has been doing since the fall of the USSR. And we need to look at the history here. And now here we are at a crisis point. And the big question arises, how to defend oneself nonviolently. And meanwhile, the weapons are pouring into Ukraine. So yes, it's a very difficult question. And the UN Charter, provides through Article 2, a peaceful resolution of disputes. I mean, we have frog hopped over all of the safeguards that have been put in place since the horrors of World War II. And we have not abided by those rules and regulations. And it's costing us dearly. The whole history of not supporting, good decisions that are trying to be made by the UN and by the Security Council. I'm no politician. I'm no expert on any of this, but I do understand that these nightmares that come to life do not happen in a vacuum. And so we've got to educate ourselves. We've got to stay apprised of what we're doing. It's so easy to blame victims. It's so easy to avoid any of the real solutions that we do have at our fingertips. An immediate ceasefire. Is Blinken working on that with his counterpart? Humanitarian aid, that should be happening rather than all of these weapons. That's very clear. What about the neutrality of Ukraine? Can Ukraine stand in a place of neutrality and have that be respected? What about removing the foreign military and the weapons, which I had mentioned earlier? And what about resuming negotiations for permanent settlement of internal conflicts? I mean, these are all things that we've been giving, the laws and the treaties and the tools and the means of practicing and implementing. And that's my answer to this whole question of how do you be nonviolent when your country's being invaded? It's very late in the game.
Thank you. Now, we have Brian Terrell here, as you know. Now, Brian wants to say a few words, which would be lovely if you could. Brian, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, I just did.
Good. And if you do that, I've now got to instruct Ian Farrer, who's running things, not to violently mute you again. This is a legitimate intervention.
Well,
Brian,
thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation and this opportunity. Brendan, you mentioned meeting Dorothy Day, and I met her in person when I was 19 years old, and Dorothy was 73. And because I was a kid, my reaction was different because I was just excited. I was hearing things I had never heard from pastors or teachers or parents. And I knew that I could be a Catholic after meeting Dorothy. And I wasn't sure about that to that point. Robert Waldrop is the good friend who wrote the prayer that Martha opened with. I think I was on the lawn of the U.S. Capitol when the Pope gave his talk there in 2015, hearing his words broadcast on the lawn with the crowd there outside the Capitol. And it was exciting to hear Dorothy's name mentioned, but I think Dorothy was given even a greater honor than having her name spoken on the floor of the Capitol when the Pope said this, and this relates to everything Martha's been saying. Here we have to ask ourselves, why are the deadly weapons being sold to those who plan to inflict untold suffering on individuals and society? Sadly, the answer, as we all know, is simply money. Money that is drenched in blood, often innocent blood. In the face of this shameful and culpable silence, it is our duty to confront the problem and stop the arms trade. Now, we also mentioned the anger, the wrath that was inspired by Dorothy and the others protesting the nuclear defense drills in the 50s and 60s, and it still happens. And ironically, it is some of this wrath is coming from the very church people and writers, critics, who are calling for Dorothy's canonization, because they're able to separate that out and to say Dorothy was a pious, charitable person, and she had these little quirks about war, but we can ignore that, we can dismiss that, and set that aside and focus on the charity and the prayerfulness. But I think that's we're missing the opportunity that Dorothy gives us, and the Pope offers us too in his address on Congress by doing that. We are at a point, as Martha's pointing out, with nuclear weapons and climate change, that it is no longer utopian dreaming. It's no longer the Sermon on the Mount and loving one another and loving our enemies. Today is the height of pragmatism. It is not wishful thinking. It's not utopian. It's the prerequisite for the continuation of human life on this planet. And it's very realistic, and it cannot be dismissed and can't be put aside. So, thank you.
Thanks very much, Brian. I've got lots of questions. I'm also getting a few messages just saying how much they appreciate this webinar and how much they appreciate having heard Martha speak and Brian. One question I've got here is, how do you think Pope Francis has changed Catholic non-violence activism? And related to that, Martha, is what support do you and co-workers, fellow activists, Catholic worker, receive from the institutional church in America in your activism, especially from bishops and other higher ups, as the question goes? And what support do you think would be forthcoming? So it's a question about Pope Francis and his difference he's made, and a question about the institutional support that Catholic worker receives. And what would you like to be a bit different about that?
Well, I understand that there has been an effort on the part of lay groups, I think Pax Christi most especially, to petition Pope Francis to address this just war issue, and I think he has done that. I think he's made it very clear that that whole narrative of deterrence was a false narrative, and that the church cannot support war in any of its form. I think that Pope Francis has been very clear, especially with his most recent statements of the barbarity of it. And one of my favorite quotes from Pope Francis is that capitalism is the dung of the devil. And he has put his finger on what it is that is bringing us to this endless war. So I feel that there's not anything more for me to ask or wish from him, and that we need to process what he has already given us and practice it. We did have one of the bishops come to our evidentiary hearing prior to our trial for the Kings Bay Plowshares action. And he and a theologian from Fordham University did a most incredible job of pointing out why our act was faith-based and why we were following, how and why we were following Catholic social teachings and the teachings of Christ. And there are some good bishops who really do want to see change and are working very hard for change in the United States. But you know, the voice of wrath and the voice of complicity is a big voice. And as far as institutional support for the Catholic worker, I think that with this effort at canonization, there are plenty of clergy who want to separate Dorothy Day from the Catholic worker movement, and you know, hold her up in her life of her heroic virtue. But we rely on donations, and for some strange reason, these donations keep coming in, and keep the miracle of our continuance keeps on happening. And as far as I know, there are not Catholic worker communities who have given money for the canonization, but there certainly are funds coming from the Benedictine communities and other communities for this cost, the scandalous cost of this Roman and diocesan phase of this project. I don't know, I insulted Cardinal Dolan in this article to the New York Times most recently, after we had this beautiful celebration on December 8th at St. Patrick's Cathedral. You know, we struggle with each other. We struggle in our relationships with each other, and this is nothing new, and this is not going to change. But I think what the example that Dorothy has given us is one of, you know, working together and not condemning each other. That's really important. And I've certainly, it's been a difficult learning curve for me, because I was very upset with some of the things that were said.
Martha, a couple of more personal questions. One is from Tamara. I think she might have had to leave early, but she's a member of the Glasgow Catholic workers. And she asks, I'd love to hear a bit more about Dorothy's balancing act, both as a staunch faith, a daily mass goer, with her politics, this balancing of busy family life with her commitment to the gospel and to nonviolence. And a similar question is your grandmother's commitment to nonviolence. It covered the whole of her life, from politics to how she organized the Catholic worker movement, and of course to her life as a mother of your mother and a grandmother to her grandchildren. Do you have any personal memories of how Dorothy put this principle into practice? And how do you try to do the same, especially in everyday life? Because you're also a grandmother, of course.
Oh, we all fail daily.
Tell me about it.
You know, grandmothers can get impatient with grandkids. Let's just put it that way. We're all only human. And I think this integration and balance of this, all these roles as a woman, mother, grandmother. You know, Dorothy was a single working mom in the 1920s, which was unheard of. And how did she find all the hours of the day to do what she did? It's pretty astounding. When we apply ourselves, it is amazing what we can get done. And let's just give each other credit for trying to do our best, in our own situations. We don't need to, Dorothy's complaint about don't call me a saint. The point she's making is there's a lot of work to be done and we need help doing it. So let's keep the focus on the work and not just this concept of holiness that none of us can attain. I don't know if that is any help to your questions, but we're tested every day with that.
Sure. We're coming to what I could ask several more questions, but one we might end on is it's a very adversarial world that we're in little things and in big things. It seems a world in which we're all getting increasingly further apart and cross with each other. And it seems harder and harder to navigate disagreement. What lessons does the Catholic worker focus on dialogue and discussion have for us all?
We have to forgive each other 70 times 7 every day. We all have to beg for a clean slate every day because, we lose patience, we lose sight of the work on occasion. We have to be there for each other despite all the disagreements, despite all the difficulties, similar to a marriage. We have to accommodate each other. We have to keep loving one another. And it all sounds so pious and difficult and otherworldly, but that's what we do. That's what we do as parents. That's what we do as activists. That's what we do as comrades to each other.
And finally, Martha, just one last question. You've talked in the past, I think written about it too, about taking yourself, spending some time away from nonviolence activism and the church. What brought you back?
That's a long story and we only have 2 minutes. I don't know what brought me back. God grabbed me by the hair of my head. I don't know.
Well,
it's hard to explain these things.
Sure. But thank you. Thank you for tonight, Martha. Thank you so much for tonight. Thank you to everybody for being here. Thank you for all that patient, attentive listening. Thanks, Brian. Some people have asked us, Brian, you're a Catholic worker, I think. Catholic worker in Dublin or?
No, in a little town in southwest Iowa.
Really?
Malloy, Iowa. The name of the town is Malloy, of all things.
Mallow.
And Malloy.
Malloy, seriously? Wow.
And I've been here for 35 years.
Okay.
And I've been with the Catholic worker since 1975 in various places. So, beginning in New York City.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight. And thank you to everybody. Really, really appreciate everybody being with us tonight. I'm going to hand you back to the CEO of the Tablet, Amanda, who's going to wind up for us and has a few messages, I think, a few parish notices. Amanda.
Thank you, Brendan. Well, that was absolutely phenomenal, and just being able to meet you, Martha, was incredible. And obviously, Brian, thank you for engaging with that as well. It just makes you want to go off and read more about it. And also thank you, Brendan, for you hosting this event. It's refreshing as well to see you have such a lovely way with you, and I could have listened to that for a lot longer. It's not actually me going to